Right now, in hangars and on-ramps at flight schools, FBOs, and private airports across the country, there are used Diamond DA40s. Some of them are gorgeous. Glass panel, well-maintained, low to mid-time engines, fresh annuals, the kind of airplane that would have sold in a weekend 2 or 3 years ago. And they're sitting. Not because something's wrong with them, not because the owner priced them at a fantasy number pulled from thin air. They're sitting because the used DA40 market has quietly entered a correction that is moving faster and cutting deeper than almost anyone in the diamond community publicly wants to acknowledge. And here's what makes it genuinely interesting from a financial standpoint. The new DA40 side of the market, which should theoretically be getting destroyed by the same forces, is actually holding up comparatively better in certain respects. That's the story. That's the counterintuitive, uncomfortable, and actually important thing happening in this corner of general aviation right now. And if you own one of these airplanes, or you're thinking about buying one, or you're just paying attention to where the GA market is actually moving underneath all the glossy social content, you need to understand what's driving this and why it matters for your specific situation. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this channel covers the financial and market mechanics of general aviation in a way that most content in this space simply doesn't. And if you want to understand where aircraft values, ownership costs, and demand signals are actually headed, instead of what the dealer or the Type Club forum wants you to believe, you're going to want every one of these breakdowns going forward. Let's start with some necessary context, because the DA40 doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the forces hitting its used market aren't entirely unique to Diamond Aircraft. They're amplified by specific things that are very particular to this airplane, this manufacturer, this buyer profile, and this era of ownership costs. But the backdrop is a general aviation used market that has been unwinding from pandemic-era highs in ways that are deeply uneven across different airplane categories. Some used airplanes are holding value remarkably well. Others are sliding. The DA40 is sliding faster than the average, and the reasons why stack on top of each other in a way that creates a compounding problem rather than a simple one. To understand what's happening now, you have to understand what happened before. During the pandemic-era buying surge, general aviation used aircraft values went on a run that honestly defied everything we thought we understood about how this market behaved. Demand exploded. Supply of quality used aircraft was genuinely thin, and prices on almost everything flew upward, sometimes dramatically. The DA40 participated in that run enthusiastically. Values that had been relatively stagnant or gently appreciating for years suddenly jumped, and buyers who had been patient and watching found themselves in competitive situations for airplanes they would have had their pick of a year earlier. For sellers, it was extraordinary. For buyers, it was alarming. And for anyone paying close attention to the underlying fundamentals, it was the kind of move that creates a very specific kind of risk on the other side, because values that rise faster than the fundamentals justify tend to come back down faster than feels comfortable when conditions shift. Conditions shifted. Interest rates moved. The economic mood among discretionary buyers, the exact people who buy personal aircraft, changed. The urgency that drove pandemic-era buying evaporated, and suddenly buyers who had been competitive and fast-moving became methodical and slow, comparison shopping carefully and in no hurry whatsoever. That cooling happened across the general aviation used market broadly, but it hit the DA40 particularly hard, for reasons we're going to walk through one by one, and the aggregate effect is a used market that has given back a meaningful portion of those pandemic-era gains faster than the new aircraft side of the same model line. Let's start with the most obvious factor and work our way toward the more subtle ones, because the obvious factor is real and significant even before we get to the nuanced stuff. The DA40 is a composite aircraft. That's one of the things buyers genuinely love about it. Sleek aerodynamics, excellent fuel efficiency, a modern feel compared to aluminum-skinned airplanes from the same era or earlier. But composite construction introduces a specific set of pre-purchase inspection concerns that aluminum-skinned airplanes simply don't raise in the same way. And as the used DA40 fleet has aged, and as buyers have gotten more educated about what they're looking for, that set of concerns has become a real friction point in transactions that is slowing deals, widening the bid-ask spread, and in some cases, killing sales entirely. Here's what's actually happening. A buyer shopping a 20-year-old aluminum 172 or a Piper Archer knows what they're inspecting for, their mechanic knows what they're looking for, and the community of mechanics who are comfortable doing a thorough pre-purchase on one of those airframes is enormous. The inspection process is well understood, the common squawks are well documented, and the buyer can walk in with reasonable confidence that they know what the likely issues are before the airplane even goes on jacks. A buyer shopping a DA40, particularly one that's now 15, 17, 20 or more years old, is in a meaningfully different position. Composite inspection is a specialized skill. Delamination, moisture intrusion, hail damage that reads differently on composite than on aluminum, repairs that may or may not have been done to proper diamond standards. These are all things that require a mechanic who actually knows composite construction and knows the DA40 specifically, and that mechanic is not available at every airport or in every market. Buyers who've gotten burned or nearly burned on composite pre-purchases or who've heard enough cautionary stories are applying more scrutiny, demanding more thorough inspections, and in some cases, simply deciding the added complexity isn't worth it compared to an aluminum-skinned alternative at a lower price point that they can have inspected confidently by any A&P in the country. What that does in practice is extend the time to close on used DA40 transactions. A buyer who needs to find a specifically qualified inspector, schedule them, potentially fly the airplane to their location, or have them travel to the airplane, wait for a thorough composite inspection rather than a standard visual check. That's weeks, not days. And every week a buyer spends in due diligence is a week they can cool off, second-guess the purchase, find a different airplane, or simply get exhausted by the process and walk away. Sellers are discovering that the inspection friction is creating a meaningful dropout rate among buyers who were genuinely interested but found the logistics of doing it right more burdensome than they expected, and that dropout rate is showing up as longer days on market, more price reductions, and a growing gap between initial list price and actual transaction price. The second layer of this is what's happening with the Austro engine, the AE300, that came standard in DA40 XLS and subsequent variants. This is where things get particularly interesting and particularly consequential from a financial standpoint. The Austro engine is a diesel cycle, jet fuel burning engine, and when Diamond committed to it as the standard power plant for the DA40, the pitch was genuinely compelling. Run on jet fuel, which is available virtually everywhere in the world, gets significantly better fuel economy than a comparable piston gasoline engine. Sidestep the entire avgas availability and leaded fuel conversation entirely. For buyers thinking about long-term ownership, particularly international buyers where avgas can be genuinely difficult to source, the Austro-powered DA40 made real, practical sense, and it sold well on that basis. Here's where the financial picture has gotten complicated. The Austro engine has had a service history that buyers and owners describe in terms that range from cautious to actively concerning, depending on which forums you're reading and which mechanics you're talking to. I want to be careful about specifics here because experiences genuinely vary, and some of this is subjective. But the pattern that shows up repeatedly in the used DA40 buyer community is concern about TBO compliance costs, concern about the depth and geographic distribution of the service network for this specific engine, and concern about what a major engine event looks like in terms of cost and downtime for an airplane powered by something that is emphatically not a mainstream Lycoming or Continental. When you're buying a used airplane and your mechanic says something like, "That's the one with the Austro engine, right? Let me do some reading before we go any further." That's not a confidence-inspiring moment in a purchase process. The engine concern compounds the composite concern in a way that creates a combined pre-purchase anxiety that is larger than the sum of its parts. A buyer who is already nervous about the composite inspection process, already worried about finding a qualified inspector, is simultaneously holding concerns about the power plant's long-term reliability and service infrastructure. Either one of those concerns, in isolation, might not be a deal killer. Together, they're enough to make a significant percentage of buyers decide that an airplane with a simpler, more mainstream, more widely supported engine and structure, even if it's less aerodynamically elegant, even if it burns a little more avgas, is simply a less stressful ownership proposition. And this is where the avgas story adds another dimension that cuts exactly opposite to how it was supposed to cut. Remember how one of the core selling points of the Austro engine was that you don't need avgas? In a world where the avgas future was genuinely uncertain, and there were years not long ago when that future looked very murky, where it genuinely seemed like leaded fuel might disappear faster than the fleet could adapt, the jet fuel burning DA40 looked like a smart hedge. Now that unleaded avgas alternatives have moved forward significantly, with approval covering a large portion of the piston fleet and distribution rolling out. Some of that urgency has eased. The airplane that was supposed to be your insurance policy against the leaded fuel problem is now competing against alternatives that have solved enough of that problem with much more mainstream, widely supported power plants, and the Austro's differentiation on fuel type is less of a decisive advantage than it was presented as just a few years back. For owners who bought specifically because of the diesel advantage, this is a painful pivot to sit with, because it means the premium they paid for that engine architecture isn't being preserved in resale value the way they might have expected. The market is not pricing the Austro engine as a premium feature in used DA40s right now. If anything, based on the transaction data and the listing behavior visible in the market, the Austro engine is functioning more as a neutral factor at best, and a mild negative for some buyer segments who prioritize service network simplicity over fuel-type flexibility. That's a significant shift from where the story was positioned just a few years ago. Now let's talk about the DA40 owner demographic and what's happening to it, because this is one of the more nuanced and underappreciated parts of the story. The DA40 attracted a specific kind of buyer from the beginning. Generally speaking, these were pilots who valued efficiency, modernity, and a certain aeronautical sensibility over tradition and simplicity. They often had more formal education in aviation or strong technical backgrounds. They were frequently instrument-rated or actively pursuing it because the DA40 is a genuinely capable IFR platform with the right avionics. They tended to skew slightly toward the younger end of the primary aircraft ownership demographic, at least relative to the Bonanza or Mooney crowd, though still clearly adults with resources. And a meaningful number of them were flying for genuine personal transportation rather than just weekend recreation, using the airplane as a real tool for covering distance at speeds and fuel efficiencies that made the economics feel defensible. That demographic profile matters enormously for what's happening now, because it intersects with several trends simultaneously that are all pushing in the same direction. The personal transportation use case that drove a lot of DA40 purchases has been under pressure from improving commercial aviation options and from increasingly compelling remote work situations that reduce the need to move between specific locations on specific schedules. A buyer who bought a DA40 specifically to fly between their home base and a business location 2 or 3 times per month is reevaluating whether that mission still exists the way it did, whether they're actually flying it enough to justify the ownership cost, and whether a leaner ownership situation or simply using commercial when they need to go would make more financial sense now. These are the sellers, the people putting DA40s on the market not because they need a more expensive airplane or a different airplane, but because they're questioning whether they need an airplane at all right now. That category of seller tends to be highly motivated to close, not in a desperate way, but in a genuine, I've made a decision and I want to execute it cleanly way, which means pricing concessions to get the deal done. At the same time, the pilot certificate health picture that affects all of GA is applying specific pressure to this demographic. Medical certificate renewal stress, concerns about the future of their flying career as they age, the awareness that insurance costs are climbing on all used aircraft including DA40s, and that insurers are looking more carefully at pilot age, total time, and currency than they used to. All of this is pushing some DA40 owners toward the exit. And because these tend to be analytically minded people who do actually run the numbers, they're often arriving at sell now conclusions before a forced sale situation develops, which is actually financially rational but creates selling pressure in the market that wouldn't be there otherwise. The insurance story on used DA40s is worth spending real time on because it's become one of the single biggest sources of buyer dropout in this market specifically. When a prospective buyer gets to the insurance conversation, which should happen early in the process and often doesn't, they are frequently encountering premium quotes that are meaningfully higher than they budgeted for, based on rough estimates or internet forum conversations. There are several reasons for this, and they stack. Composite aircraft carry a higher hull value per pound and per unit than comparable aluminum airplanes, partly because repairs cost more and partly because the replacement cost accounting is more complex. Insurers price that accordingly. The DA40, even a 15-year-old example, tends to carry a hull value that is higher than what a buyer might expect relative to a comparable vintage aluminum 4-seat single, and the premium reflects that. That's not unreasonable from an actuarial standpoint, but it's a shock to the system for buyers who did their initial insurance homework on the wrong comparison point. Beyond hull value, the Austro-powered variants carry their own underwriting questions from some carriers. Not across the board, Not universally, but enough that some buyers are finding their insurance search on a diesel DA40 takes longer and comes back with more variation between quotes than they expected, which slows the transaction and occasionally surfaces uncomfortable numbers. A buyer who was counting on a specific monthly ownership budget and who gets an insurance quote that meaningfully exceeds the line item they had mentally allocated is now looking at a deal that pencils differently than they thought it would, and some of those buyers step back rather than adjust their expectations. Layer on top of all that the general tightening across the GA insurance market that has been well documented. Underwriters pulling back from certain categories, premium increases that outpace almost any other line item in an airplane's operating budget, carriers requiring more experience in type before solo privileges, and you have a used DA40 insurance environment that has become noticeably more expensive and more complicated to navigate than it was 3 or 4 years ago. Every buyer who gets surprised by that reality is a potential deal that stalls or collapses, and enough of those stalled deals translate directly into longer days on market, more motivated sellers, and ultimately lower transaction prices as sellers adjust list prices to compensate for the buyer attrition they're experiencing. Now here's where the story takes its most counterintuitive turn, and this is genuinely the heart of what makes the DA40 situation distinctive compared to a lot of other used airplane categories. You would expect that everything we've described, the composite inspection concerns, the Austro engine questions, the insurance friction, the demographic pressures on existing owners, would be hammering the new DA40 side of the market just as hard or harder. Because a brand new DA40GX or DA40NG from the current production run commands a price that makes even the pandemic-inflated used values look modest by comparison. A properly equipped new DA40 from Diamond's current production is going to run you somewhere in the neighborhood of $400,000 and change when you're done optioning it the way most serious buyers actually want it equipped, which is to say, with a full Garmin suite, autopilot, everything that makes it genuinely useful as a cross-country IFR platform rather than just technically capable of it. That is a significant number. That is a number that should, by any conventional logic, be extremely vulnerable in a market where buyers are cautious, financing rates are elevated, and used alternatives of the same model are available at prices that represent a meaningful discount. And yet, the new aircraft side of the DA40 market is not collapsing at the same rate. New delivery timelines from Diamond are not showing the same kind of ramp inventory buildup that other manufacturers are dealing with in comparable segments. There's still a queue. Still buyers willing to wait and willing to pay. And understanding why that's happening tells you something genuinely important about both markets simultaneously. The first piece of this is that Diamond has a manufacturing pace that is, to put it generously, boutique. Diamond isn't building DA40s at a rate that fills ramps with unsold inventory the way a Cessna or Piper might, where the production volumes are high enough that a slowdown in sales velocity creates visible, embarrassing ramp inventory quickly. When your production numbers are measured in dozens of units per year per model rather than hundreds, the gap between build rate and sell rate doesn't produce the same optics problem in the same time frame. A manufacturer that moves slowly is somewhat insulated from the specific crisis of visible unsold new inventory, even if the underlying demand picture has softened, because they never built so far ahead of the market that the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The second piece is that Diamond buyers, specifically new Diamond buyers, tend to be among the most brand-committed and specification-focused buyers in general aviation. The people who have decided they want a factory-new DA40 have usually been thinking about it for a while, have cross-shopped the alternatives, and have landed on Diamond specifically for reasons they've articulated to themselves carefully. They want the current G3X suite, with the factory integration that doesn't come from an aftermarket retrofit job on an older airframe. They want the current crash safety standards built into the composite structure, rather than an older design with different certification assumptions. They want the factory warranty and the documentation chain that starts at 0 hours and never has a gap. These are buyers who've done a cost-benefit analysis and concluded that new is worth the premium over used for their specific priorities, and they're not the same buyers who are flinching at the used DA40 market's concerns about aging composite, Austro service network depth, or pre-purchase inspection complexity. The third and perhaps most interesting piece is that the DA40's used market problems are, paradoxically, making the new aircraft argument slightly easier to make in certain conversations. When a buyer who's been shopping used DA40s for 3 months finally sits down with a Diamond dealer and lays out everything they've been wrestling with, the composite inspection logistics, the Austro engine questions, the insurance difficulty, the uncertainty about what they're actually buying when they buy a 15-year-old composite airplane, the dealer's job of making the case for new becomes, in a strange way, somewhat easier than it would be if the used market were healthier. The friction the buyer has experienced in the used market is doing part of the dealer's work for them, converting buyers who arrived as used shoppers into new buyers, out of frustration with the used process, rather than out of any initial intention to spend that much money. That said, it would be wrong to suggest the new aircraft side of this market is thriving without qualification. The absolute price is genuinely high, financing it at current rates is genuinely painful, and there are buyers who want a DA40 specifically, but cannot bridge the gap from what they can find in the used market to what Diamond's current production costs. Those buyers aren't going to the new side. They're either waiting, compromising, or exiting the DA40 consideration set entirely and buying a different airplane. The new market is holding up better than the used market, but holding up better than a struggling comparison point doesn't automatically mean healthy. It means less distressed, which is a meaningfully different thing. Let's talk about the specific used DA40 vintage and variant breakdown, because not all used DA40s are in the same position, and that difference is significant enough to matter if you're shopping or selling. The earlier DA40 variants, particularly the original DA40, with the Lycoming IO360 gasoline engine, are in a genuinely different position than the Austro-powered variants, and in some ways a better one from a market liquidity standpoint. The Lycoming IO360 is one of the most widely understood, most extensively supported piston aircraft engines in general aviation. If you took a survey of experienced GA mechanics across the country and asked them how comfortable they are maintaining, troubleshooting, and performing major work on an IO360, the overwhelming answer would be very comfortable, because there's essentially no corner of general aviation where that engine isn't familiar. For buyers worried about service network depth, worried about what happens when something goes wrong at a random airport in a random state, the Lycoming-powered DA40 answers those concerns cleanly. That doesn't mean the composite inspection questions go away for these older airframes. If anything, they're more pronounced because these are now genuinely old airplanes, some of them approaching or exceeding 20 years old, and aging composite has its own specific inspection checklist. But at least the buyer coming into a Lycoming-powered DA40 is only carrying one unusual concern, instead of two stacked on top of each other, and that makes a real difference in buyer psychology and in how quickly deals close. The Lycoming DA40 is also benefiting from something interesting happening in the unleaded avgas transition. Because UL94 and now GAMI G100UL have made meaningful progress through the certification and distribution landscape, the Lycoming-powered DA40's future fuel story is actually clarifying in a positive direction, whereas the Austro engine story, which was supposed to be the fuel-secure alternative, is now competing against a conventional fuel solution that's more realistic than it looked a few years ago. So the buyer who passed on a Lycoming DA40 because they were worried about avgas availability is now looking at a future where that worry is at least partially resolved, and the argument for paying an Austro premium based on fuel security has weakened accordingly. The DA40 TDI, the earlier diesel variant with the Thielert Centurion engine, rather than the later Austro, is in arguably the most complicated position in the used market right now. The Thielert story in general aviation is not a happy one. The original company filed for insolvency, the engine went through multiple ownership and service organization changes, and owners of Thielert-equipped aircraft went through a period of genuine uncertainty about parts availability and technical support that left real marks on the resale value of anything powered by that engine. Continental eventually took over support for the Centurion engine, and the situation has stabilized in meaningful ways, but the history lingers in buyer perception, and a used DA40 TDI with a Centurion engine is fighting that history every time a buyer does their research. These are not moving quickly, and the sellers who have them are discovering that the discount required to attract and retain a buyer is substantial enough to be genuinely painful relative to what they might have hoped to sell for, based on recent comparable sales that included better powered examples. Now, let's talk about what the collapse of the used DA40 market means in practical terms for different categories of people who have a stake in it, because the implications vary significantly depending on where you're sitting. If you're an owner who's been thinking about selling, the time pressure on that decision is real, and I want to be honest about that without being alarmist. Values have been declining, and the factors driving that decline are not resolved on any short horizon. The composite inspection friction is structural. It's not going to disappear because buyers suddenly stop caring about pre-purchase thoroughness. The Austro engine concerns are structural. They're tied to a service network that grows slowly, and to a technology bet that is being reevaluated in light of conventional fuel alternatives. The demographic pressure on the owner base is structural. It's tied to aging, to life changes, to the evolution of how people use airplanes, and none of those things reverse quickly. If you've been waiting for the right moment to list, and you've been telling yourself you'll wait until the market comes back, I'd encourage you to have a very honest conversation with yourself about what specific development you're actually waiting for, because it's not obvious that the trend reverses on any timeline that's comfortable to wait through. That said, selling into a declining market doesn't have to mean accepting the first lowball offer that shows up. The used DA40 market is illiquid by nature. These aren't common airplanes. The buyer pool is specific, and a well-presented airplane with excellent maintenance records, a recent comprehensive pre-purchase that a buyer can use rather than having to commission their own, and a story that proactively addresses the concerns we've talked about is in a materially different position than one that shows up on a listing with 3 photos and a vague maintenance note. Sellers who invest in making their airplane story easy for a buyer to trust are consistently closing faster and at better numbers than sellers who present the minimum and expect the buyer to do all the trust-building work themselves. If you're a buyer in the current used DA40 market, the picture is considerably more nuanced than buy now while prices are low, even though that might sound like the obvious conclusion. The real question isn't whether prices have come down. They have. The question is whether they've come down enough to compensate for the specific risks and friction factors we've described, and the honest answer depends heavily on which variant you're looking at and what your own situation looks like. For a buyer who has found a well-documented Lycoming-powered DA40, has access to a competent composite inspector in their region, has run the insurance numbers with a real aviation insurance broker, specific to their experience level, and has genuinely worked through what the annual inspection and maintenance cost structure looks like for an aging composite airframe, there are good deals available in this market right now. The discount from pandemic highs is real and meaningful, and a buyer who does the work to understand what they're actually buying can acquire a capable, efficient, genuinely enjoyable airplane at a value that a few years ago simply didn't exist. For a buyer who is tempted by the lower prices but hasn't done that specific homework yet, who is working from internet forum estimates for insurance and maintenance, who hasn't had a real conversation with a diamond-experienced mechanic about what aging composite inspection actually involves, who hasn't priced out what a major engine event on an Austro would actually cost, and how long the airplane would be out of service during it, please do not shortcut that process just because the price looks attractive on the surface. The factors that are driving prices down are real factors, and a buyer who skips due diligence and buys into one of the less well-documented examples in this market right now because it's cheap is going to discover what cheap actually means in this context at the worst possible time, which is after the transaction has closed. The pre-purchase inspection piece deserves its own emphasis here because of how central it is to the DA40 specifically. Do not use a general A&P who hasn't worked on composite airframes and ideally hasn't worked specifically on DA40s for your pre-purchase inspection. I know that sounds obvious, but the combination of market enthusiasm, geographic constraints, and buyer impatience means this step gets compromised far more often than it should, and the consequences of a superficial pre-purchase on a used composite airplane can be significant. There are DA40 type clubs with lists of recommended inspectors. There are diamond service centers that have seen hundreds of these airplanes come through their shops and know exactly where to look and what to worry about on an airframe of a given vintage and hour count. Use them. The inspection will cost you more in time and probably in money than going to the nearest airport with an A&P, and it will be worth every dollar and every extra day if it surfaces a problem you would have otherwise bought, or if it gives you a clean bill of health that you can actually trust. Now, let's turn to a factor that gets discussed occasionally in the DA40 community, but not often enough in the context of what it means for market value specifically, and that's the avionics situation on older examples. The DA40 was marketed strongly as a glass panel airplane from early in its production run, which was genuinely forward-looking for its era and a big part of what attracted the technically minded buyers the airplane drew. The problem is that the glass panels from that era, and even from the mid-2000s, are now significantly behind what modern buyers expect, and more importantly, some of them are behind in ways that go beyond aesthetics. Certain earlier avionics suites have support constraints, database update challenges, or parts availability issues that are real ongoing ownership concerns rather than just cosmetic inconveniences. A buyer who walks up to a used DA40 with an early Garmin G1000 that hasn't been updated in several years is looking at a potential avionics refresh conversation that can run into real money when you price it out properly. Compare that to a used DA40 from the more recent fleet that was either delivered with or retrofitted to a current generation Garmin G3X or updated G1000 NXI suite, and you're looking at a meaningfully different ownership proposition from an avionics standpoint, both in terms of capability and in terms of ongoing costs. The spread in the market between examples with current well-supported avionics and examples with older suites that need refreshing is real and should be reflected in pricing. But sellers who are working from top-line comparable sales without distinguishing for avionics state are often finding their negotiating position weaker than they expected, because informed buyers are making those distinctions and discounting accordingly. This avionics layer adds another wrinkle to the comparison with the new aircraft side of the market. When a buyer who is deeply interested in current avionics capability sits down and honestly prices out bringing an older DA40's panel to a state they'd actually be happy with long-term, the gap between that cost-adjusted used price and the new aircraft price sometimes compresses more than the raw numbers would suggest. Not always enough to tip the decision to new, the gap is still substantial in most cases, but enough to make the conversation more interesting than a simple sticker price comparison would imply. Let's spend some time on the rental and flight school angle, because it provides important texture to the market picture and is something individual buyers don't always think about but should. The DA40 has been used as a training platform at a number of flight schools, particularly schools that emphasize modern avionics training and want students to get time in a glass panel airplane that's more representative of what sophisticated private owners fly. That fleet use has created a supply of training hours DA40s that periodically cycle through into the used market, and training hours airplanes are a specific and somewhat complicated category to evaluate. On one hand, training fleet airplanes are often maintained to a rigorous standard because a professional flight school operation requires that both for safety and for regulatory compliance, these aren't airplanes with deferred maintenance because an owner was financially squeezed in a given year. On the other hand, the cycles-to-hours ratio on a training fleet airplane is typically much higher than a privately owned airplane because touch-and-go training is landing-intensive in a way that a cross-country private owner's flying typically isn't, and landing cycles matter for certain airframe and landing gear components. A DA40 with 2,000 hours of training use does not present identically to a DA40 with 2,000 hours of private cross-country use, and buyers who don't understand that distinction are sometimes caught off guard when an inspection surfaces wear patterns or component conditions that seem inconsistent with the hour count on the log. The other issue with training fleet DA40s coming onto the used market is that they often carry the avionics vintage of when the school purchased them, which may or may not align with current standards. A school that bought a fleet of DA40s in 2015 and kept them in service through their useful training life is now selling airplanes with 2015-era panels, and the market is pricing that accordingly. These can be excellent value if a buyer's avionics expectations are calibrated correctly, but they require honest assessment of whether the existing suite serves the buyer's intended mission or whether a panel update is part of the deal from day one. There's an interesting regional dimension to all of this that's worth acknowledging, because the used DA40 market doesn't behave identically across the country, and a seller or buyer in one region may have a meaningfully different experience than someone in another. In regions where jet fuel is reliably available and priced competitively, which describes most of the US, but not all of it, the Austro engine's fuel advantage is modest in practical terms. Jet fuel is at the FBO, you can get it. It's not a significant logistical challenge for most of the country. In regions where avgas infrastructure is genuinely thin, or where some airports have limited fuel options, the jet fuel capability of the Austro becomes more practically meaningful and commands a modest buyer interest premium accordingly. That regional variation means that an Austro-powered DA40 may sit longer and require more price negotiation in a market where fuel availability isn't a pressing concern, but might move relatively more efficiently in a market where jet fuel availability is a genuine practical advantage. Similarly, the composite inspection resource question has significant regional variation. In areas with strong diamond dealer presence or with flight schools that have run DA40 fleets and developed local mechanic expertise with these airframes, the pre-purchase inspection obstacle is lower than in regions where the nearest diamond knowledgeable mechanic is a ferry flight away. A seller in a region with good local expertise for this airplane is in a better position than an otherwise identical airplane in a region where every interested buyer has to figure out their inspection logistics from scratch, and pricing should probably reflect that reality, even if it feels uncomfortable to acknowledge. Now I want to address something that comes up in the DA40 community forums fairly consistently when this topic arises, which is the defense that the airplane is undervalued and that people who understand it properly will recognize its value and pay accordingly. This argument deserves a serious response rather than a dismissal, because there's a kernel of genuine truth in it that's being used to rationalize something that the data doesn't fully support. The DA40 is a genuinely good airplane. Let me be unambiguous about that. The aerodynamic efficiency is real. Fuel burns that routinely underperform comparable competition on the same route are documented and not disputed. The crash protection philosophy built into the composite structure reflects genuine engineering intention, and the safety record of the DA40 fleet has real positive elements. The handling characteristics are described consistently positively by qualified pilots who have meaningful comparison points across multiple types. None of that is in question. The airplane has genuine merit. But here's the thing about market values. They reflect not just what an airplane actually is, but what buyers perceive it to be, what they can easily confirm through inspection, what they can efficiently get insured and maintained, and what they believe its trajectory looks like relative to alternatives. An airplane can be genuinely excellent and still be undervalued by the market if the friction to verify its excellence is high, if the ongoing ownership cost story has become complicated, or if the buyer pool has become thinner and more hesitant for structural reasons that have nothing to do with the airplane's aerodynamics. The DA40 is in exactly that position right now. Genuinely good airplane, genuinely complicated ownership proposition to explain and verify, genuinely thinner and more cautious buyer pool than a few years ago. Those factors don't cancel each other out. They coexist, and the result is what the market is showing you. Sellers who are waiting for buyers who really understand the airplane to show up and pay full value are going to be waiting for a while, because the buyers who understand the airplane best are also the buyers who are most aware of the complications and most calibrated about what those complications are worth discounting. Sophisticated buyers don't overpay for quality. They price quality correctly alongside complexity, and that's not the same as a naive buyer who simply misses the value. A DA40 buyer who's done their homework isn't failing to appreciate the airplane. They're appropriately pricing the full ownership package, and that full package, right now, carries complications that push negotiated transaction prices lower than optimistic sellers want them to be. Let's talk about where this goes from here, because market corrections aren't permanent, and understanding the trajectory matters as much as understanding the current state. The honest answer about the used DA40 market's future direction involves holding a few things in tension simultaneously. The factors that have pushed values down are largely structural and slow-moving, meaning they don't resolve quickly or cleanly. Composite aging is physics, not sentiment, and it accumulates with time rather than reversing. Service network depth for the Austro engine grows at a pace determined by Diamond's dealer investment decisions and by the training and certification of independent shops willing to add that capability, and that's a years-long process rather than a months-long one. Buyer demographic pressures are driven by large population-scale trends that don't reverse on any near-term horizon. On the other side, the factors that could partially stabilize or modestly improve used DA40 values are also real. If Diamond continues to develop and expand the Austro service network, buyer concerns about remote engine events may ease measurably over time. If the composite inspection resource community grows, either through more mechanics getting Diamond-specific training or through Diamond's own service infrastructure becoming more accessible, the pre-purchase friction decreases. If overall GA market conditions improve, if interest rates ease, if the economic mood among discretionary buyers improves, if insurance rates stabilize, those tailwinds lift this segment along with everything else. The most realistic scenario, based on everything we've described, is a used DA40 market that finds a floor at levels meaningfully below pandemic peaks, stabilizes there for a period, as buyers adjust their expectations and seller inventory clears through at the new price structure, and then potentially sees gentle appreciation as the compounding factors resolve slowly over several years. That is not a buy now and profit handsomely in 18 months story. It is an understand what you're buying, buy at current values if the mission and the airplane make sense for you specifically, and hold with realistic expectations story. For the sellers who need to exit now, the advice is the same as it always is in a declining market. Price for the market that exists rather than the market you wish existed. Invest in presentation and documentation to narrow the bid-ask spread as much as possible. And close clean when you find a motivated and qualified buyer rather than holding out for the next one who might or might not show up. Waiting in a declining market costs real money in both value erosion and carrying costs, and timing the bottom of a specific niche market in general aviation is considerably harder than the forums make it sound. There's one more dimension worth addressing before we wrap up, which is what the used DA40 market situation tells us about the broader used GA market, and whether the patterns we've described here are predictive for other composite or specialized aircraft categories. The short answer is yes, with important distinctions. The DA40 situation is partly a story about factors specific to Diamond and the Austro engine, but it's also a story about what happens to any used aircraft category when you layer aging composite concerns, specialized service network requirements, insurance friction, demographic pressure on owners, and a shift in buyer psychology away from the urgency that characterized the pandemic buying environment. Any aircraft category that checks several of those boxes simultaneously is going to experience similar pressure on used values, regardless of whether the airplane is a Diamond, a Cirrus, a TBM, or anything else that shares some of these characteristics. The Cirrus SR22 community has been having versions of this conversation, not identically, but with meaningful overlap, particularly around aging composite on older examples, around CAPS activation history, and its implications for inspection and airframe certification, and around insurance dynamics that have gotten genuinely complex for certain buyer profiles. The TBM community at the used